Thanks, everyone. We'll just wait a couple more minutes and we'll be getting started shortly. I just want to wait for a couple more joiners. In the meantime, worth having a look at the joining instructions on the screen. This meeting is being recorded. We want to make sure that anyone who wasn't able to join this event tonight is able to watch the recording back. So a recording of this will be uploaded onto the website. Just to be clear, though, you will not be able to your face will not be as part of the recording. Any questions that you have will be kind of captured through the Q&A chat box. So you can, if you have any questions throughout the session, just drop your question in there, and we'll read it out at the end in the Q&A section. We'll be starting shortly. If you have any technical issues in the meantime, please do email or contact us through the chat box. The email is on screen. Thanks. Hello, everyone, for joining. I can see we've got a couple of attendees online. Welcome. We'll be getting started shortly. Just a reminder, I think you might have had a notification when you joined that this meeting is being recorded. It's being recorded so that we can make sure that we upload it to the website afterwards for anyone that was unable to log in tonight. On the screen, you can see the panelists from the project team. We'll be doing some introductions shortly, just ahead of the presentation. And there will also be a Q&A session at the end. So if you have a question, please do type it in the Q&A box at any time throughout the presentation or at the end in the Q&A section. And also just to note, if you do have any technical issues, then you can get in touch through the email address that's on screen now. We'll wait 2 more minutes and then we'll get started. Okay, we'll kick off. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining. We're going to start with some introductions from the project team. So I'll hand over first to Duncan, if you could just introduce yourself.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining. My name's Duncan Rowe from Beltane Asset Management.
Thanks, Duncan.
Hand over to James.
Thank you, Duncan. Good evening, everybody. My name's James Willatts from Beltane Asset Management.
Thanks, both. Maybe over to Gerald Eve.
Yeah, hi everybody, I'm Catherine Tyne, the planning consultant Gerald Eve, and I'll hand over to Alex.
Hi, Alex Neil from Gerald Eve, and apologies, my camera doesn't seem to be working, but I am here.
Thanks, Alex. Maybe Jack next, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Absolutely. Good evening, everyone. I'm Jack Baker, associate here at Haptic Architects.
Fab, thanks. And I think Daniel as well. Lastly, would you like to introduce yourself?
Evening, everybody. I'm Daniel Snape, I'm the project manager.
Thanks, Daniel. And lastly, I'm Ellie Tucker from London Communications Agency. We've been supporting on the consultation engagement for this project, and I'm joined by Sarah from our team, who will be managing the tech. With that, I'll hand over. The presentation that's going to be presented by Jack from Haptic and also Duncan from Beltane. Over to you guys. Thanks.
Thanks, Ellie. I'll start off first. So my name's Duncan Rowe from Beltane Asset Management. We're a central London developer. We set up our business about 15 years ago, and in the last 15 years we've developed around 20 buildings in central London, all predominantly commercial buildings. There's on this slide, there's 4 there, which are more recent. We're actually currently on site with 2 of those. The 2 on the right-hand side, the top one in Farringdon, which is about 130,000 square foot office building, which is due to complete towards the end of next year. And then a larger one just on the north side of the Millennium Bridge in the city, which is about 250,000 square feet, which we're due to complete at the end of this year. We're focused on particularly sustainability. So what we do is we tend to take buildings which are at the end of their life and use as much of the existing as we can to give them another 25 years life. So that'll be reusing the existing frames of these buildings as far as we possibly can and rebuilding off those. As I said, sustainability is our main focus, but it also saves with time as well. We don't have to demolish as much, so we're on site for a shorter period of time, and it gives us the opportunity to really produce what we like to do is produce a building that's effectively brand new and take it back to the market as a new building. And attract the best tenants as well. So this is a building that is actually owned by a business called Top Plan Group. They've owned the building for about 22 years. The building is currently occupied by Bupa. They're leaving the building in November this year. So the plan is to be on site as soon as we possibly can. We're not in the business of obtaining planning consents and then selling on to someone else. These are buildings that we will proceed with. We have funding in place, and the plan is to refurbish, relet, and then hold for another 20 years. I think that's from me. I'm going to hand over to Jack, our architect, who's put a scheme together that we're really excited about, and it's an area we're particularly excited about as well. It's certainly that stretch of Gray's Inn Road, we think, needs some improvement. We've got a building here that's, as I said, at the end of its life. Something needs to happen to it, and we feel we can really produce a best-in-class office building. So over to you, Jack.
Thank you, Duncan. Good evening, everyone. I'm just going to take you through this presentation to sort of describe the proposals ahead of planning submission. So for all of you, hopefully are aware, the building itself is 300 Gray's Inn Road, so about a 5-minute walk south of King's Cross Station. It's within sub-area 14 of the Bloomsbury Conservation Area, and also forms part of the sort of recently created Knowledge Quarter within the Borough of Camden. The building itself is 1970s construction. It's an L-shaped block with a lower 3-storey on Acton Street and a taller 8-storey, including the roof plant, on Gray's Inn Road. If you just go on to, sorry, Sarah, do you mind going on to the next slide for me? Just as a very brief introduction to Haptic, so we are the architects for the projects. We are based in London, Oslo, and Bilbao, with sort of Scandinavian values at the heart of the work that we do. But we are also very local to Camden and the borough itself. Recently, we're just finishing a project, W3, which is a new community centre out the back of King's Cross Station. So really excited to be kind of continuing our work within the borough, and particularly around the sort of opportunity that this project sort of entails. If you go next slide. Okay, so just as an outline of the project itself. So as Duncan's kind of outlined in terms of the actual building, it's really reaching the end of its current lifespan. And one particular note here is the environmental performance. So the EPC rating currently is G, which, because of the latest policy that's in place, that's no longer a lettable building for commercial use. So inherently something needs to be done. The second point here is the conservation area. It's an incredibly rich area within the city, There's a huge amount of history here, but the building itself is rather detrimental to the conservation area it sits in. The third point here really is around the sort of the future of the area. And as I mentioned around the Knowledge Quarter, the idea that there's a real drive for new office space and a new sort of office space to act as the support network for all of the great institutes and companies that in and around the King's Cross and St Pancras area and further south of Gray's Inn Road in towards Bloomsbury. And the final point here is just general deterioration. The building itself is showing signs of its age. The plant equipment in particular is at the end of its servicing life. And there's a real need to do something new here. So if you just flick onto the next slide. So rather than seeing it as, you know, a challenge, so to speak, of what to do with this building, we actually saw this as there's a real opportunity here to improve several things for the area. So firstly, it's responding to the climate and biodiversity emergency. And the construction industry has around a 40% impact on the total carbon emissions within the world. And so there's a real pressure on us to really be sort of thinking ahead of how we might sort of reduce the total carbon for the schemes. And the biggest thing here is really around this proposed retention of the existing frame, the existing building, to really sort of maintain and reuse what's already there. Secondly, is that with the need for a new skin, because the facade is currently greatly underperforming, how might we sort of flip that on its head and see it as a chance to create something that is a bit more positive for the conservation area? Thirdly, is around healthy office space and really wanting to see that, you know, things have moved on in a great deal since this building was originally designed in the 70s. And there's a far better sort of importance really for the health and well-being of building users and people within the building in terms of daylight, sunlight, use out, green space, all are really important in terms of people's experience. And the final one here is new to the actual site itself, is the need within the borough for new homes. And so rather than just proposing a 100% new commercial space for the site, there is also 7 new homes that will be provided within the scheme. So if you pop on, I think we'll get into just a bit of the background of the site, but I'm sure most of you are sort of aware of the rich history and its location. So just maybe here, as sort of outlined, is just its location within the city and on Gray's Inn Road. If you go to the next one. So historically, the site has really shifted in the past 200 years. So from the 19th century with a whole string of sort of housing within the area and a real sort of industrial heritage there with warehouse spaces fairly prominent within the area. Now, due to sort of World War II and bombings, a lot of the area was actually heavily damaged. And so there's been a number of sort of new builds and developments in and around the Gray's Inn Road, Acton Street and Frederick Street area. So one of those being the actual corner site, which we're talking about today. And so in the 70s, the scheme that's here now was built. So if we flick on to the next slide, we'll get to understand a little bit more around the sort of wider context as it currently stands. So we can see Gray's Inn Road, which is this primary artery within the city, the surrounding sort of green spaces that, albeit there are a vast number of them, they're not particularly linked well within the sort of dense urban context. And King's Cross and St Pancras Station to the north. And so in terms of sort of active travel, there's a great P-TOW rating for this site. So access to tube, buses, the site itself is on the red route as well. Just onto the next slide, I think we zoom in a little bit here. So just getting a better understanding of the sort of immediate context. So everything here in yellow is a listed building. Anything in the more sort of turquoise teal color is a positive building as outlined within the conservation area appraisal. So you can see our building that we're talking about today is neither listed and also isn't a positive contribution to the area. And that really sort of sums it up in terms of the opportunity there to try and bring something a bit better to the site. If you move on to the next slide, I think we can then also look forward as well. All of these buildings that are highlighted in pink are, in fact, 2 of them are already in construction. And number 330 Grazing Road has consent, and I'm sure will be in construction soon enough. And you can start to see the sort of emerging context here. So when I talk about the context, I mean in terms of scale and mass of building, and also the height, where 330 Grazing Road is up to 14 stories tall. And there in blue, you can see the current building as it stands. So just flicking on now, we'll go on to a bit about the way we approached designing this building. And a huge factor here is the importance of the conservation area and the townscape in particular. Now, Grazing Road is seen as a very varied character within the appraisal. There's a lot of different heights, bulk and mass and scale. But a real important factor here is the neighbouring residential streets, which are the listed townhouses that you can see on both Acton Street and Frederick Street and the wider area. And so it's really important for us when developing the designs that we really sort of focus and analyse these views to ensure that we're actually providing something that's better than what was there before. Okay, I think if we flick on now, we should be getting into a bit about just the overall massing of the scheme that we're proposing. So there's a series of sort of steps here, so we can go through these fairly quickly. But this first principle I really want to outline, which we've mentioned already, is that the greenest building is one that already exists. And with sustainability aspirations a real sort of driver for the scheme and for Beltane and Topland as the owners and developers of the project. That's a real fundamental that we started with the scheme. So if we move on to the next slide, we can see this is what is currently there, and you're all sort of aware and see each day. If we move on, our first step is to get rid of the sort of the deteriorating plant enclosure on the 8th floor. And then if we just move on, then a 2-story extension is proposed on top of the existing building. This is well within the sort of the wider view corridor to St. Paul's. That does actually go across the site. Then the next slide. So knowing that sort of height, albeit is very sort of, it already exists within the surrounding area, we wanted to take a few extra steps in order to try and reduce the overall mass and its appearance within the area. So a number of these setbacks have been introduced on the top floor to both the south and the west. Further setbacks on the 8th floor and the northwest corner, and also a ground floor where we're sort of creating a new recessed entrance, presenting the commercial entrance to the building on Grazing Road. So moving that corner away, the corner entrance away from that congested part of the site. If you go on to the next slide, a step that is really important here is that we've pulled the core of the building out. To really kind of provide much needed improvements to the office space, but also to create a more subservient piece of massing that acts as a transition step between the taller and the smaller element. Next step is with regards to the smaller 3-story element on Acton Street. So a 2-story extension here is proposed, but again, what we're doing on the upper floor is setting it back from Acton Street to reduce its overall sort of presence when viewed along that street. Next, we're looking at the retention of the existing structure. So here we're retaining all of the existing floor slabs on the taller end of the building and looking at retaining as much as possible on the smaller components. Then looking at the actual extension itself, we're really wanting to mitigate or minimize both carbon, but also sort of the loading onto this existing frame. So that's done by introducing a lightweight structure for those floors. And then if you move on to the next one, you'll see the sort of proposed massing. Now, I appreciate this is just a simple volumetric diagram to explain the steps that we've taken. But if you just flick on to the next slide, just to outline some of these key points that we want to address. So the first one is in terms of height. We're well within the established neighbouring height of Acorn House, which is the building in the bottom left corner. We've also used those massing steps and pushing and pulling that I've described to further reduce its sort of presence on the street. We've also, with the building stepping down, that smaller component acts as this transition between the 3-storey townhouses on Acton Street and the taller scale and mass that's present on Gray's Inn Road. And then the final point there is as I mentioned, the northwest corner is heavily congested at the moment where the entrance is. There's a very, very busy pedestrian crossing and very little pavement space in front. I think it's about 1.5 meters in total. And so the move we made here is to take that entrance away from that congested part of the site and place it within the middle of the commercial. If we go on to the next slide. So just to sort of reiterate a bit around the approach to sort of retention and how we've avoided demolition. So the facade, sadly, we've had to look at taking off simply because it's just incredibly low performing. But the structure, having done investigation, seems in pretty good shape. And we really feel we can get a new lease of life out of it. So what we've managed to do, I appreciate some of the text here on this slide hasn't quite come out right. So apologies for that. But those numbers still stand. We are targeting overall sort of only 10% of the superstructure to be demolished. So that's a 90% retention. We're currently at 12%, but that we're looking at ways to sort of greater improve that. So we just flick on, you'll see these step diagrams. As you see, this is the existing. Everything here in red is that we're looking to remove simply to allow us to sort of create those massing moves that I have outlined already. And then the final one is just looking at the new structure that we're introducing. So if you're just able to flick onto the next slide, you'll see here everything in green is what's new in the proposal with that lightweight infill. Okay, and then I think we can start to see the actual sort of appearance of this building within those views I mentioned in the townscape before. So this is a view from the north of Gray's Inn Road. And if we flick onto the next one, so that's what it currently is like. And then here's the proposal. So we feel there's a far better sort of contribution to the surrounding sort of townscape. And we can just move through these. So this is from the south on Gray's Inn Road, the existing condition. And a big thing here, what we've done is that large blank masonry wall from the south, which is quite sightly. We've looked to introduce windows and fenestration there to try and break it up and to open the building up. And that's a big thing that we've done here is really look at how we can remove away from quite a defensive facade that it currently is and create something a bit more transparent and open and a bit more welcoming for the area. Moving on to the next slide. So this is from sort of the corner of Ampton Place and Frederick Street, just to the southeast of the building. And if you move on to the next one, so you can see here that the previous sort of red brick stands out quite prominently. And we've worked really hard on this elevation to really sort of both step the massing down to reduce its overall visibility, but also in the material palette choice is far more in keeping within the sort of the wider material palette of the conservation area. And then on the next slide, you'll see the view now from Acton Street as it currently stands. And if we go on, you'll see the proposals here. So really looking again to sort of work with and sympathetically respond to the conservation area, rather than being something quite contrasty that is currently there in the site. If you move on, I think you get a little bit of a sense now from the rear of the building. So this is from the southeast, looking axonometrically. This is what the existing building is like. So this is the current condition, and you can see the courtyard out the back, which is essentially just a service yard at the moment. And if we move on to the next one, you'll see the proposal. So just a few key points that we want to address here is firstly the existing building footprint, that we are staying within that footprint. And the result of that is that we're able to align to the sort of the footprint of the residential buildings immediately adjacent on Acton Street. We've also sort of stepped the massing out to try and mitigate any sort of impact. And because we're within that existing footprint, we're not decreasing any distances between buildings on either the Acton Street side or even on the rear towards the back of the Frederick Street buildings. And just to highlight that smaller block on the back, that is where all of the residential homes will stand. So an important thing here is that the residential component acts as a buffer between existing residents in the area and the commercial space, which is in that taller component as well. Another just thing to perhaps kind of pull out here is just in terms of overlooking. So as mentioned, they're all homes within that smaller block. And so all of those windows that are there are for the residents of those homes. In terms of windows within the offices, there is a strip of windows up that eastern elevation. Now, because of there's quite an acute angle, visibility lines out are quite restricted. And the final one is actually on the southern elevation, where we've introduced new windows. And what we've tried to do is create an array away from the sort of the rear garden spaces, so that there's no sort of no chance that anyone within the office space looking out those southern windows will actually be able to sort of see down into any of the rear of the gardens, to avoid any sort of overlooking from that way. So if we flick on, I think we'll see a little bit here just about the sort of materiality of the building and its overall quality. So as I mentioned before, there's two, albeit it's within one conservation area, there's two quite distinct characteristics of the two roads at the site kind of corners. So Gray's Inn Road is heavily varied, varying sort of scales of mass and materiality. And then if we move on to the next one, the surrounding residential streets, there's a lot more order to them, a finer urban grain and a repetitive nature to the architecture that exists there. And so really the challenge here for the design of the exterior appearance of the building was how can we essentially turn that corner, and how can we sort of respond to both the larger varied scale of Gray's Inn Road and the smaller, finer grain and repetitive nature of Acton Street and the surrounding residential. So we've done that by, if we just move on, firstly, just appraising the existing facade. And as I mentioned, it's incredibly defensive. Those windows are tinted, so you don't get any views in. The materials as well are of fairly poor quality. And overall, the sort of proportions of the building, they don't particularly give anything back to the area. And one sort of final thing is really the sort of the top of the building is in fact sort of its ugliest. And as you tend to look up at a taller building, seeing that sort of fairly ugly plant enclosure isn't the greatest view. So definite things that we really want to look at and improve upon greatly with the proposal. So we've done that by firstly sort of establishing a series of themes. And really that's driven by creating something that is calm and light and ordered, that has a natural quality to it, and is also an element of sort of decoration to really try and fit in and respond to the conservation area. The next slide, we look at it within the sort of wider streetscape. And so what we've done on the elevation to Gray's Inn Road and the taller commercial part is introduce a sort of a coarser grain in terms of the scale of the building. We've introduced a strong vertical definition within the facade treatment. There's a rhythmic window pattern across the facade, which really in keeping with a lot of the surrounding buildings. And we've also looked closely at the sort of the ground floor and the traditional shop fronts that you can see on to the right hand side of this image, looking at sort of those larger windows, store risers, and so on, to really try and be a bit more in keeping with what's already there historically. And then if we move on the turning the corner on Acton Street, here we've gone far more down the residential route. So really trying to take those ideas that exist within those Georgian townhouses, the stucco ground floor base, the proportions of windows as you move up the building, but without trying to be just a facsimile and a copy and not honest with what the building is. So there's a slight change of sort of direction in terms of being more of a transitionary, slightly different version of what we can find within the surrounding area. If we just flick on, this is then getting into a bit more of the actual materials. And a huge thing here is around trying to introduce something that is a bit more natural, that's a kind of far lighter and has a bit more texture. And one important thing is that it's a lot more open as well, so that you can get those views into the building and through it. So if we just flick on, I think we've got a little bit here just around the sort of base studies. So the approach that we've taken here is to introduce a sort of a natural material through, in the sense that it's got a grain and a texture, and looking at sort of lightweight material as well, because we don't want to add too much weight to this building's facade. Behind this as well, I just want to point out that there's a significant uplift in insulation, and that's one of the key factors here, is to really improve the thermal performance of this building. And we've done so to really sort of increase that sort of EPC rating drastically from its current level of G. So looking at sort of a concrete facade, you can see it here in elevation on Gray's Inn Road, a bit more zoomed in with that central recessed entrance. And you can already see how much more open this building feels. There's ventilation panels to the right of the windows. This allows sort of natural ventilation to the office floor. So again, trying to reduce the overall energy and demand of the building for the future tenants. And then if we flick on, you'll see, you know, just an indication of the stepped areas that we've made on the upper floors allows us to introduce some terraces to the south and the west of the building, with also a very smaller one on the east. Now these are up on the 9th floor, and they provide sort of fantastic views across London, but they also importantly offer a chance to introduce a bit of biodiversity. So there's absolutely no landscaping whatsoever within the current building. And as I mentioned early on, there are significant green spaces within the area, but what's lacking is this continuation and bridging almost. It's really important for species in terms of their migration around the city. And so there's an opportunity here to use both soft landscaping to the terraces, but also green roofs on all of the roofs to provide that sort of space for insects and birds to utilize. If we just move on, I think we've got a few slides here just to fairly briefly run through the layout of the building. So a ground floor on the left-hand side, there's a fairly clear sort of separation here. So the left-hand side is the commercial part of the building. In the middle is the new core, as I mentioned earlier on, that acts as this sort of separator between then what is on the right-hand side, which is the residential component of the building, as you go down Acton Street. Another thing to just mention here is that service yard that currently stands in place. We're looking, the proposed scheme looks to transform that into a new outdoor amenity space with soft landscaping, allows the sustainable urban drainage and attenuation within that space. Also just provides a place outside for building users to dwell from the commercial building. And then if we just flick through to the next slide, you'll see just this is a typical layer. It's the first floor. So you can see the open plan office on the left-hand side, the core in the middle. And then on this floor, there are 2 residential homes. So there's a 2-bed 4-person and a 1-bed 2-person. And you can see their terraces and balconies that are attached to the southern side. And you can also importantly see the relationship, as I explained, to number 55, where the building itself sits within the same footprint and aligns to the back. And then I think we can sort of flick through the next ones. So this just is the, sorry, just go back. Yeah, this is the 4th floor. So there's a slightly different variation on the layout for the homes here. So there's just one flat on the top floor here. This is because we've got the setback at the front onto Acton Street. So you can see that terrace that's introduced on the top of that component of the building. And then, yeah, you can sort of flick through these layouts, moving up the building to the top floor here, where, as I mentioned before, those terrace spaces you can see highlighted on the west and the south, and that small one on the east. Okay, I think we've got one more section that I just really wanted to sort of, I think it's very important that we sort of look into, because the sustainability side of the project has been a real sort of key factor and fundamental in the design. And really, the way that we approach it is this holistic approach that ourselves have within the office, but both Beltane and Topland are completely behind and really sort of pushing forward this agenda of how we can sort of create an exemplar project from a sustainability perspective. And so here, this is sort of our internal process, and the way that this manifests itself, if we move on to the next slide, is that we've set up a series of key targets from a sustainability perspective. Now, these targets are not simply just what policy requires us to do. There's a real commitment here to go beyond simply just the statutory compliance, where we're looking beyond simply just getting excellent, trying to target outstanding for BREEAM, the energy statement, which is all about the energy use of the building, going beyond the 35% reduction to 50%, and if possible, even further, looking at embodied carbon to really try and establish that target early on, so that we are always trying to reduce the embodied carbon of the scheme. Circularity as well is really key. There's an existing building here. How might we reuse some of what's already there beyond just the superstructures we've described? But also look to the new build and to see when that becomes the end of its life, how might we be able to design it to disassemble to make things easier? And an EPC rating of A, improving the urban green factor, and there's many more, but I won't go into them all because I'm conscious of time. So just to sort of very briefly outline the sort of that overall strategy to the sustainability. If we just move on to the next slide, what you'll see here is the sort of holistic approach. And so there are renewables maximized to all of the flat roofs on top of the residential and the office building, green and blue roofs as well, to both support biodiversity, but also to help with water attenuation. Looking to a sort of a low carbon, lightweight on-fill for the structure for the extension, retaining the existing structure, looking at natural ventilation for the office floor plates, looking at intelligent building management systems in order to not just simply move in and leave it as it is, but to learn from the building, to learn through the different seasons of the year, and to see how best to utilize the building and its facade. And also the possibility of potential sorts of re-harvesting of water on the site. And then sort of moving into the sort of finer grain of both the sort of winter and summertime. So the commercial facade, we've worked really hard to try and create a facade that reduces the overall need to use energy for heating and cooling. So the intention here is that the building itself can do a lot of the work, adopting passive measures. So in summertime, we've worked hard to sort of establish external shading within the actual kind of design of the facade, which reduces solar gain, which reduces then the demand for cooling. Whereas in the winter, which you can see on the left-hand side there, we've actually looked at how you might get as much of that heat in from the sun, look at the sort of heat performance of the existing structure to retain heat, to allow that to then be dispersed back into the office, to overall try and reduce the demand on the heating energy for the building. And then if we just flick on, I think we, just to sort of summarize as an overall, the scheme here, which we're incredibly sort of excited about, we worked really hard as a team, but also closely with the local authority as well. And this sort of summarizes this webinar, the end of the public facing consultation as well, to get everyone's feedback. We're really sort of excited about the possibility and the opportunity with this project. And really there's some key factors here that we just want to outline at the end here, which is, you know, it's about looking to the future and supporting the expansion of the Knowledge Quarter with real, like, much needed high quality workspace. To look at an existing building and transform it into something that can perform beyond sort of what even modern standards require. Providing new homes for the borough, which are incredibly important at the moment. How it might enhance the conservation area and be a positive contribution. To very importantly, sort of actually add some greenery to the site beyond what is currently absolutely zero. But also to sort of open this building up so it doesn't feel like this defensive piece of the city, and that it's a building that could actually be celebrated as part of the Bloomsbury Conservation Area. And the final point there, as I kind of previously outlined, is how we might use this building to support the road to net zero by using a retention of existing structure, driving down embodied carbon and driving down the overall sort of energy demand of the building through passive measures. And yeah, and that is me. So I think I'll pass back over to Ellie. There is one more slide, but I think that gives a bit of an overview of just timelines.
Thanks for that, Jack. So with that really opens up the next section of the webinar, which is the Q&A section. I've seen a couple of questions already submitted, but just for anyone else, just to reiterate, if you do want to drop a question to the team, there should be a little box in the bottom side of your screen, Q&A box. Just type your question in there and we'll read it out and come to it in this section. I'll kick off with the first question, and actually we know this question also came up in the consultation event, the in-person consultation event we had a couple of weeks ago as well. It's kind of focused on the proposed terraces, and a question for Jack, I think. You know, what measures and how we mitigate any noise or overlooking from the terraces? Over to you, Jack, on that one.
Sorry, I muted myself then. Yeah, no, in terms of the terraces, and I'm going to start firstly with what's being proposed for the commercial aspect of the building. So the first step we've taken is really to try and focus them away from the residential area. So the largest part is on the western elevation, which is onto Gray's Inn Road. So away from any chance of sort of overlooking. Also to the south, there's fairly restricted views down as well. And because you're higher up as well, there's no sort of chance there of seeing in. And on the east, again, the height there sort of really minimizes the opportunity for any sort of overlooking down. So they're the sort of the fundamentals that we began with. But beyond that as well, there will be a sort of management plan in place around the sort of use of those terraces to really ensure that there isn't any sort of harmful impact on neighbours next door, from a sound and sort of perspective, and also from a light perspective. And I think the sort of, perhaps if the other bit is a little bit about the residential terraces, which are slightly lower down. Now, as I mentioned, they're all within the existing footprint of the building. And so there's already an established sort of distance there between buildings, but we're looking at sort of further screening in as many locations as possible, just to really ensure that there's no chance of sort of any overlooking.
Thanks, Jack. And I've got next question here. It's on the conservation area, and I suppose and the kind of nearby listed buildings, and how we feel these our proposals are in line with this and respond to it.
Yeah, so I think I sort of touched on it a little bit in the presentation. So the building itself is not listed. In fact, it's sort of seen as a rather sort of detrimental component of the sort of surrounding area. And so we firstly sort of tried really hard to work and learn, I guess, from the conservation area and the character and the two different characters you've got on Gray's Inn Road and on Acton Street. To find a sort of a material palette that feels in keeping without it being a complete copy. so that it can sort of help to transition between those two distinct sort of characters of the site. And I think, because it's a very important thing that we work carefully to sort of consider, particularly the Georgian townhouses, which are listed on Exton Street. And there's a number of measures I've outlined there to really try and overcome what we feel is the current condition and provide something that it is a better solution.
Thanks for that. Next question, and I can see we've got a number of residents on, local residents on the session tonight. I just wanted to kind of touch on a question about construction impact and how we're considering mitigating that. So I might hand over to Beltane just to speak on that.
Thank you, Ellie. I'll take that question. I think really, as Duncan was saying, it starts in the design and retaining most of the building. 90% of the structure is existing, so that's where we start the process, and it goes right the way through to contractor selection and making sure that we've got professional, reputable contractors that are on the list that are happy to engage with the local community, keep them updated, newsletters. The project director's telephone number would always be on the hoarding, so any issues can be dealt with promptly and directly with the contractor on site. We'd continue to hold meetings through engagement with the Camden Council and giving community updates via that means, and then also monitoring any noise or pollution, both dust, noise, during the construction period to make sure they're within acceptable levels. Yeah, I think that covers that question.
Thanks for that, James. Next question I had, and it's quite it's about the extension and the new floor. I think this is a question, Jim, do email if I've read this wrong, but I think it's the kind of materiality and kind of that lightweight extension. A little bit more detail on that, Jack, please.
Yes, at this stage we're sort of really wanting to explore as many options as possible within the design. So as it currently stands, the design, there's flexibility in the use of what structure there may well be. So that's everything from, there is the possibility of exploring CLT, which comes with its own challenges, through to sort of a more traditional sort of steel version. So we're sort of looking at that range still, and wanting to try and find the best solution for this site. So apologies that isn't sort of an exact answer to that question, but it's because we haven't settled yet on that final solution.
Dan, sorry, I'll just jump in there. Dan, have you got anything to add on that? Because it's something we'd love to build these things in CLT, in timber. We'd love to do it, but as Jack's just mentioned there, it certainly comes with its challenges at the moment. Dan, have you got anything else to add on that?
Yeah, I suppose the key factor is kind of the risks associated with building in timber and the fact that it's relatively new to the industry. So it's kind of balancing that all. As Jack said, it's open still to be explored, but there's a number of kind of hoops we have to jump through first. It's definitely a preferred option. It's just whether or not we can do it with the existing height of the building as being the kind of main limiting factor. So
Thanks all. Next question, and I can see this is from another local resident who lives on Acton Street, and again it's on the extension and kind of impact of that extension. I suppose the question is kind of how we considered daylight sunlight in terms of that extension. So possibly back over to Jack.
Yeah, so it's definitely a factor. As I outlined, we've looked to step back the massing as much as possible on the upper floors, to really sort of minimize and mitigate any sort of impact there. We have a sort of a daylight sunlight consultant, and as part of the planning submission there'll be sort of a submission with that, which will sort of analyze the overall effect that it will have on neighboring properties. And so, yeah, there is definitely a balancing act here with that, but we've worked as hard as we can to try and sort of minimize any harm, so to speak.
Yeah, I think. Sorry, Jack. Sorry to jump in. I think that's key. We've got to write sort of a daylight sunlight consultant who's been on board right from the very beginning of this, obviously with the residential there. So all the design has taken that into consideration, and that will be submitted as part of the planning application.
Thanks both. And then I've got a final question here, and again from a local resident, just on that ground floor and kind of, you know, that ground floor use, and, you know, are we considering shops, cafes? What's the final kind of tenant looking like? Possibly back over to Beltane maybe on that one.
Yeah, I think Jack probably comment in a moment just with regards to what we're looking at on that ground floor, but you mentioned tenant or tenants. When it comes to designing these things, it's really key to have complete flexibility. Perhaps we get a single tenant, perhaps we have a number of tenants, but as part of the design, you know, we need to cover everything. Jack, as far as the ground floor is concerned.
Yeah, I think that's a key factor there. So the ground floor of the residential component won't have any shops or retail in, and the ground floor of the commercial is intended for a commercial use by a tenant. But the way it's been designed is to try and open it up as much as possible. So albeit there may not be a specific sort of cafe or shop there, the idea is that it's transparent and open, and so you can see the activity within the building and the commercial floor, just to sort of add to the streetscape of the building.
Thank you. I'm looking here, and I think that is all the questions that we've had through tonight. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining. I hope that was an informative and useful session. If you do have any questions that you've thought of, you know, after the event, then please do email through to the consultation email address that you should have. Just to remind you all that this is a recorded session, and we will be uploading it to the website, so there is a record of this, and for anyone who kind of has missed tonight's event and is enjoying the sunshine, they'll be able to watch it back. But thanks everyone, have a good evening. We'll end it there.